Hello, my name's Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and today is January the 6th, 2026. It's just been a few days into the new year, and there's been a lot of action already. Of course, Congress, the whole world, clutching at their pearls concerning the kidnapping of Venezuelan incumbent President Nicolas Maduro by U.S. forces, who was transferred to uh, New York, American soil, to face apparent, it could be pretextual charges of uh, drug dealing. But in any event, I've done a video explaining, right, the geopolitics, what's really going on, right? I talk about history and the history of our presidents, and in it, of course, American history and history of other major powers in the world unfold. Their history unfolds. So things are not always exactly as they ostensibly, apparently make out to be. There's a lot of smoke screen, uh, in the world of geopolitics, and so from my analysis, right? Most of the world knows that, well, this isn't about drug dealing. It's about oil. Like, right, Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves in the world by far. But not just that. You see, the world's oil is running out. Right, the big oil producers are running out. Saudi Arabia, they have just about 80 years of proven oil reserves left at the rate they've been pumping. And of course, Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, was America's reliable source. America's got oil as well. But America, at our rate, the rate we pump oil, uh, we are the largest producer, right? But we produce over 13 million barrels a day. And of course, we're running out of oil. We have just about 15 years of proven reserves left. China, our main rival in the world today, possibly our only rival, right? Potential rival. It's a demographic power. It is also an economic power. China currently has the largest GDP in the world. It surpasses America's, right? Uh, so China's oil, proven oil reserves, they have just about 16 years. So the same as America, 16 years left. 16 years is not a long time. 15 years is not a long time. But Venezuela has oil for almost a millennium. A millennium is 1,000 years. They have proven oil reserves for about over 885 years, right? So it's a no-brainer. What is it that America has, right, that more than China? Our military might, right? No nation in the world has the military capacity of the United States, right? Our military spending about $1 trillion a year. It surpasses the next nine biggest uh, nations with military who have the military capacity, right? So nobody compares to America. Now, taxpayers are not, we don't pay all that money for our soldiers, our military to sit down and twiddle their thumbs, right? So they've got to use it. So the oil's sitting right there in our backyard, our neck of the woods. Uh, the America's pivoting on Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is out, right? It's a 19th century imperialist doctrine, right? And we've since had things to overthrow it. Monroe Doctrine is illegal, right? It's illegal in if we consider international law today with the United Nations, right? So when we go Monroe Doctrine, we're saying we're going back to naked imperialism of the 19th century again and medieval imperialism, right? So that's what we're going back to. The Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt corollary. And the idea of the Monroe Doctrine, by the way, was to keep major powers out. That's America is going to dominate the affairs of the Western Hemisphere, right, including Latin America, to keep European powers out. It was the European powers that were the biggest powers in the world at that time because they having influence in the Western Hemisphere would threaten America's national security. In the 19th century, America was just an irrelevant power at that time. We were not powerful, right? In fact, the reason we got our independence was because uh, Europe's England's rivals, the mother country, their rivals supported America, right? So England was the strongest at that time. They had the strongest naval power. England had just gone through the Industrial Revolution, so they were powerful, right? And of course, we had the Atlantic separating us from England. Um, England had just become bankrupt from fighting France on our behalf, right? And so England was weakened, sort of, and France, Spain, Holland, England's rivals supported America to weaken England. So that succeeded. That's how we got our revolution. So in geopolitics, there are no permanent friends, there are no permanent allies. You have to keep that in mind. When you study history, you learn this. No permanent friends, no permanent allies. You change allegiances. And this is what we're going to learn in today's discussion. I'm going to be discussing Napoleon Bonaparte, right? I'm going to be discussing Napoleon Bonaparte today. But first, let me just tie up what I was saying about the oil. So again, what Donald Trump did is in the world of realpolitik, as advanced by German Chancellor of the 19th century, Otto von Bismarck. You know, realpolitik is not moralistic. It's practical, and it's based on a principle to do what a nation has to do in order. It's a national policy to advance with the sole principle of advancing the nation's an entity's national interest, right? And it's not moralistic. It's not ideological. It's cynical. It's cold-hearted. Americans understand it in the phrase, you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet, so to speak. So that's sort of realpolitik. And that's what Donald Trump, a businessman, and his coterie, that's how they're thinking. And that's why they've taken this move. And, nobody, who's going to stop America? It's got the strongest military in the world, right? And of course, it's an act of desperation as well. But it's a very valuable strategic move, right? It's oil for 1,000 years. If America doesn't have it and China has it, China's strategy is to finesse its way with other nations' natural resources. It finesses, does alliances and things like that. Well, in this, if China is able to finesse its way and get that Venezuela's oil. Venezuela is just a tiny, its population is just 30 million people, right? And if China is able to have that resource in its arsenal, America's screwed, right? America's not going to be number one power in the world anymore. It's over. China's already an economic power, and then if it has Venezuela's oil, right, America's leadership is done, right? So what is it that we have? We wouldn't always have that money to spend on our military to make it the strongest in the world. We won't, right? China has a population that's ruthlessly efficient, right? America doesn't have the efficiency of China, right? Regarding being a world power, a leading power, you know, China has done that rodeo before. It's not its first rodeo, right? uh, Gunpowder, guns, cannons. They were invented by ancient China, right? When they had uh, empires and kings and dynasties that were the most powerful, right? So they've done. It's not their first rodeo at power, so they have a new ascendancy going on, right? Um, so that's geopolitics for you. So today I'm going to be talking about Napoleon Bonaparte. Why are we talking about Napoleon Bonaparte? If I like talking about American presidents, well, our presidents, Americans, our history is intricately tied with uh, European powers and the leaders of Europe, right? So Napoleon has a very strong relationship with America. Everybody knows Well, people who know history remember the Louisiana Purchase, right? Louisiana was created by the French. It was chartered. I've done a video explaining how Louisiana was actually chartered by the French government as a penal colony in 1719, right? It was a place they sent their undesirables, convicted criminals, and prostitutes. They just sent them there. So Europe was doing that back then. They would just eject those they considered undesirables. And so Louisiana, which is part of America now. Now, what was called Louisiana included other territories, other that have become that have become distinct states within the United States today. So it was larger than just Louisiana, right? So many other territories, that have become, distinct states today. Um, and so, and also the other, apart from the state of Louisiana that we know today, Orleans, that had, uh, that was chartered by the French. Napoleon is also significant, right? Because he's the one who sold Louisiana to um, to uh, to Thomas Jefferson, right? Was it in 1803 or 1804, which instantly doubled America's uh, land mass, right? The deal was negotiated by James Monroe, who went on to became fifth president, and of course, Thomas Jefferson was the president at the time, and Napoleon was emperor of France. Napoleon needed money, and he originally asked for about $100 million, but he settled because Napoleon was always fighting wars, right? And so we see Napoleon's very connected with America. If Napoleon hadn't sold Louisiana, well, America probably would not have lasted and become the power that it is today. That would not have happened. So we're also lucky that so our early presidents also were terrified of Napoleon, wanted to keep Napoleon out of America, right? So it was another reason why they tried to immediately buy Louisiana, because there were rumors that Napoleon was going to carve an empire in North America. So our leaders were terrified because Napoleon was dominating Europe. So I'm going to talk about Napoleon Bonaparte today and talk about how there were strategic alliances in Europe. That was how they were able to defeat him, right? Various European powers who had at various times been enemies, they aligned together, set aside their differences to be able to defeat Napoleon Bonaparte. So this is something Americans have to watch out for. If we're seeing various world alliances, if they eventually align together to try and check America's power, because so European powers who had fought each other for centuries, since the time it's after the Romans, right? The Romans were an uh, uh, they were a redoubtable, they were the undisputed world power in their era, the Roman Empire, in the during since the time of Augustus, right? Nobody could rival them. No entity, no nation rivaled the Romans at that time. But after the Roman Empire started to fall away during the Dark Ages, right? Its might started to decline, and the empire moved its operation, its center, the capital, from the western side, from Rome, to the east, Constantinople, Byzantium, which is part of Turkey today. It's called Istanbul. Moved it to the east, and so there was a decline in its power. Um, and since the time of the Dark Ages, Western Europe started to grow again. Western Europe had been part of the Roman Empire, but they started to grow under a guy called Charlemagne. And after Charlemagne, later kings, the French and the English. But these kings started to, they fought constant wars with one another. And of course, then there were the Germanic uh, kingdoms as well that were rising, right? The Germanic powers. There was Prussia and all these, and there was Russia. So they were rivals, and they constantly fought wars with one another. So European powers were used to fighting wars. in the 19th century with the ascendancy of the Germans under their chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. And so the concept of the realpolitik that I was talking about, it was under him. It was uh, uh, it was perfected under the rule of Otto von Bismarck. And so the European powers wanted to now maintain what was called a balance of power, right? That no power would be too powerful, right? That others would always feel threatened and they would go to war. So you see, that's when they carved the world into spheres of influence. So, they're separating their lanes, sort of what the mafia in America did under Luciano, right? But, they created the commission and just separated spheres of influence so they didn't constantly go to war. Well, the mafia learned that from what the European major powers had done in the 19th century when they created spheres of influence. Of course, you learn of the Berlin Conference, and they divided Africa, of the part of Africa and other parts of the world, that, okay, you take this place, you take this place. So that was European major powers just dividing the world, right, on the spheres of influence, so they didn't butt heads, to try and, as a temporary, it was an expedient to try and prevent wars amongst themselves. Um, and the reason for this was because of their constant warring, right? After the French Revolution, Napoleon came and he rose. So let me talk a little bit about Napoleon. Napoleon is also very significant because I talked about the Roman Empire. So, you might wonder, how am I jumping from the Roman Empire to Napoleon, a Frenchman? Well, what if I said Napoleon was a descendant of Romans? Napoleon was Roman, right? Uh, in fact, I once mentioned this to a French guy in one of the classes I took. I think it was a class on the Russian Empire. Yeah, it was a Colombian. I said, Napoleon was actually Italian. And he goes, no, 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 he was French. No, 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 he's French, he's French. So Napoleon was actually, he had Italian heritage, right? Napoleon was an Italian. His original name, given name was Napoleone Bonaparte. Bonaparte was spelled B with a U before the O, Bonaparte, right? Um, of course, it was Frenchified as Napoleon Bonaparte. So Napoleon was born in the island of Ajaccio in Corsica, the island of Corsica. It was an Italian island, but in 1769. However, he became a French subject. He was born a French subject because a year before his birth, France had acquired that Italian island from Genoa, right? Genoa, of course, is a French, it's part of Italy, right? So France acquired uh, Corsica from Genoa in the year before Napoleon was born, and that's how he came to be a French subject. So Napoleon, his first language was Italian, right? He spoke Italian with a Corsican accent, so he was an Italian by heritage. His parents were lower Italian uh, nobility, very lower gentry, right? And so he always spoke French with an accent, but he identified as French. He went to a French military school. Um, it's interesting. I've mentioned before that I did military history in Nigeria, and I was taught by a British man, Dr. Yearwood, and he would always emphasize that Napoleon, if the French Revolution had not happened and changed things, ended the Ancien regime, Napoleon would never have the world would never have known Napoleon. He would never have done the things he did because Napoleon was not a French aristocrat, right? And under the Ancien regime, only the aristocrats could become military officers, right? So he joined a prestigious French military academy through the maneuvering of his mother. He and his mother were always very close, and his mother was very ambitious. But Napoleon was not a French aristocrat, so he would not have become a general. But fortunately for him, events occurred, and that's where you see the luck of, the luck. serendipity, things, things that beyond one individual's control that occur in history and affect an individual's destiny. And so Napoleon did not create the French Revolution, but he did. The French Revolution helped him. So he would never have become a military officer, right? He would never have become a general if the French Revolution had not happened, because commoners, people who were not members of the French aristocracy, could not be officers, and so the French Revolution happened, and the commoners, they purged the aristocrats from the military because they viewed the aristocrats as the aristocratic officers as traitors. They guillotined them. Those who were not guillotined fled, ran to other places, ran to America. That's another important reason. So America welcomed, that's Philadelphia especially. So a lot of French who fled France during the French Revolution settled in Philadelphia, including a Monsieur Genet. I've done a video talking about him. Monsieur Genet was a French diplomat who actually tried to incite Americans against George Washington during their wars, their war against England. But by the time, he was unfortunate that his patrons had been overthrown, and, there was a warrant for him to be arrested and guillotined. So George Washington let him stay in America, and he became an American citizen. So a lot of French officers fled France and settled in America. And so it created a vacuum, right? It created a vacuum during the French Revolution and the following years, because European powers started fighting France, right? Because the rest of Europe, they were run by monarchs, and all these monarchs were also related. That's one, and of course they realized that if France could just execute their commit regicide and do away with the aristocrats, that they would eventually come and target the monarchs of these other European nations, and so all these European nations started to fight France. So it created a vacuum. There was a vacuum of officers, and that was how Napoleon had the opportunity. And of course, the leaders of the revolution created a career for the talented people, right? The careers for talent. They opened up. They tried to change the system and open up advancement to people of merit, that let things be merit based instead of by birth, right? Being an officer in France and in Europe back then was by birth. In fact, one of the officers who helped America during the revolution, our own war of Revolutionary War of Independence, was Lafayette. A number of landmarks are named after this French aristocrat, Lafayette, right? He was an officer, a young officer. Back then in Europe, being an officer was open to people by their birth, right? Not so much merit, but by birth. And so Lafayette was one of those people who, eventually was targeted by the French Revolution, and he was lucky, he was imprisoned, he lost all his wealth, but he was lucky that he wasn't guillotined. But he suffered a lot, and he lost his fortune. But he was, he found sympathies and help. There were uh, powerful people who sympathized with him and made sure he wasn't executed. So this was what was going on. And Napoleon, during the siege of Toulon, was a young man. He showed great skill in artillery. He was a brilliant man. He was a mathematician. He was very good in math. And, he went to military school, a French military school. He was a very intelligent man, even though he was tiny. It said he was between 5'2" and 5'6". He had a big head, but he was a brain in terms of military strategy, and without a doubt. So in military school, people study Napoleon strategies, and people study Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was another brilliant military strategist, right, for the Roman Empire, for the Romans. And so Napoleon showed exceptional bravery and skill in the siege of Toulon, and they made him a general at the age of 24. He became a general at the age of 24. Again, he would never have become a general, an officer, without the French Revolution. because then in France, uh, the positions of flag officers, being an officer, it was only open to people of aristocratic birth, French aristocratic birth, which Napoleon was not. But things changed and they made things merit based, right? They made the system merit based, and so Napoleon was able to rise rapidly and with the constant wars, and he scored a number of strategic uh, successes. And of course, eventually, he did a coup when he escaped. He was in Egypt briefly. He did a coup. He escaped. Uh, and there was a British naval officer, Horatio Nelson. So I'm going to talk about my sources real quick. So I remember as a child growing up in Nigeria again, I was very fortunate. There was a library in my home. My father, we had lots of books. I was where I had all the biographies of all American presidents. I guess some were hagiographies, of course, and I read them, devoured them. Come from a family that where we loved books, and of course, I got to read the biography of Horatio Nelson, Admiral Nelson. So Admiral Nelson, and I also read the biography of Napoleon Bonaparte. I loved his biography. I read it many times as a kid, and also the biography of Otto von Bismarck. So these are the sources I'm using today. I just thought I should discuss them. I read all these books as a kid, so I'm talking from what I remember because I read them several times. They were fun reading, and of course I also read the history of Europe from 1750, right? And what else? Triumph of the West, right? So Triumph of the West gives you a through line of how things were. That was another book I read. It was how um, the kingdoms, European kingdoms, were evolving, right? Triumph of the West. So that's what I'm using today for this discussion. So Napoleon fled Egypt, and he had to sneak through Egypt. So there was a British naval officer, Admiral Nelson, who kept defeating Napoleon. So again, England was the undisputed naval power. And later on, at the Battle of Trafalgar, Admiral Lord Nelson would defeat Napoleon again, would defeat Napoleon at the Battle of Trafalgar, which French and Spanish ships, naval ships, were decimated, were destroyed, without England losing a single battleship. So, but Napoleon fled into France, and there was a coup. They staged a coup, and some uh, leaders of the assembly who thought that they could manipulate Napoleon because he was a young man. I think he was about 29, 30 when this coup happened. So they thought they could manipulate him. He didn't. He wasn't of French aristocratic birth, right? So they expected they'd be able to manipulate him and dominate him. Uh, Now, something Napoleon did, though, he married a French woman who was much older, Josephine. She was much older, but uh, she was from the French aristocracy, right? So he married a much older woman. They didn't have children together. So, so there was that coup, and he was one of three consuls, and he became a first consul. So he was de facto dictator, right? He was de facto dictator, and eventually started to do away with the charade of there being like a triumvirate, and eventually became sole dictator, and ultimately he crowned himself emperor. He actually put the crown on his own head, right? The Pope had to put a crown on Charlemagne, right? Like almost 1,000 years before, but Napoleon put the crown himself on his own head as Emperor of France. So, as Lord Acton said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And of course, this is consistent with Napoleon Bonaparte. If you study the leaders of Europe, or many leaders in the world, many of them probably, psychiatrists will say that they have megalomania. They're megalomaniacs. They have these delusions of they're grandiose, right? So Napoleon was brilliant. Maybe I shouldn't go so far as to say he had a mental illness, but he was a very brilliant military strategist, and he kept defeating every European power one after the other, apart from Great Britain, right? Um, one after the other. Now, however, what caused Napoleon and his military forces to start to unravel was their ill-fated siege invasion of Russia, right? And another source I used was War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Of course, while I was detained, I got to read War and Peace, which is often called the world's greatest novel. So, Leo Tolstoy wrote not just a novel, but he wrote some kind of history because he's writing history and he's giving you the psychology, how Napoleon must have thought. And he writes a philosophical book as well. It's a philosophical book. And what he's doing is he's trying to debunk the myth of uh, the man of destiny in history, because this was how historians wrote. Historians liked to, during the medieval period, 19th century, they wrote about the single man of destiny that changes the world. So if you're talking about a history of England, you don't talk about the history of regular people, what's going on. Everybody focuses on King Henry VIII or Queen Elizabeth, right? And during the middle ages, on her life, right? That single person and how all the stars were aligned to just put this man of destiny or woman of destiny to shape the world. And so this was what Leo Tolstoy was contending with in War and Peace. War and Peace is a very remarkable book. It's over 1,200 pages. It's a large book, but it's worth it, right? So I loved reading it. It was while I was wrongfully detained by a corrupt megalomaniacal judge in Montgomery County, Judge James Bonifant, right? So I was reading that book, War and Peace, and he's talking about Napoleon a lot, how Napoleon invaded Russia and he thought it would be easy, but Russia's terrain, the climate, it just it it decimated the French. And that was the beginning of the unraveling of Napoleon. So Napoleon would defeat a European nation and form an alliance with them. He defeated Spain, Holland, everywhere. He defeated them all except England. After he was defeated at the Battle of Trafalgar by Lord Nelson, he gave up an invasion of Britain. So something that's so important. Remember how Romans loved war. Well, I guess the blood of Romans was definitely coursing through the veins of Napoleon, of course, who was an Italian, right? He was an Italian, and those Romans just loved war, right? And that was the same with Napoleon. Napoleon just couldn't stop. And that's, I had done an earlier video talking about Augustus. Augustus knew when to stop, and that's why he remains the greatest leader in history, at least the past 3,000 years. Augustus knew when to stop. And so when they're talking about Augustus, they focus on Pax Romana, right? The peace of Rome, right? He used that peace. Everybody just knew that, okay, hey, don't mess with Rome. Rome's the most powerful nation. Rome, he stopped the civil wars, and Rome, he focused on developing the architecture of Rome. He focused on building Rome. And again, Augustus was understated. He wasn't flamboyant. If you saw Augustus, right, in a crowd, he was just a regular person. He didn't wear flamboyant clothes. He didn't live a flamboyant lifestyle. He was a simple man. He was understated. He understood his uncle, who had made him his adopted heir, his great uncle, Julius Caesar, was flamboyant, and that made him an easy target, right, of other jealous patricians who killed him, right? They didn't like that. So he knew not to offend the aristocratic class. Now, I was also talking about why it seems historians don't focus so much on Augustus. I guess because he was a patrician, and it just looked like Augustus was a very lucky man. Again, there was a saying in Rome that may you be as lucky as Augustus and as good as Trajan. So Trajan is the one who's considered, the greatest emperor, Roman emperor, because, but without Augustus, there'd be no Roman Empire, right? So Augustus was understated. He wasn't flamboyant. And these were things that, however, Napoleon Bonaparte was not. Napoleon Bonaparte was very flamboyant. He made himself emperor. and he continued to be a target of the European monarchs. So even though they made alliances with him, pacts with him every time he defeated them, and he even married into them. He married an Austrian princess, so he married into the European families, but they still formed alliances against him, and eventually was defeated in the Battle of Waterloo. So there's that saying: every Napoleon Bonaparte his meets his Waterloo. He was defeated by the Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo in Belgium. So he was a brilliant general. He defeated everybody. But you see, one way to defeat a very strong, powerful adversary, right, is to just combine, right? So former enemies combined against Napoleon, right? Spain, England, Austria, Russia, Holland, all these former rivals, right? The British had defeated Spain at the battle, the Armada, right? They defeated the Spanish Armada under Queen Elizabeth. I think this was it 1588, the 16th century. You see, these former rivals realized they had a common enemy who had supremacy. They didn't like that because he felt threatened, because Napoleon didn't know when to stop, right? Just would not stop. So America, as we're the most powerful nation in the world now, uh, a way to easily defeat America is if those European powers that are weakened today, if they were to now align with Russia. They've done it before. They aligned with Russia a long time ago, aligned with China, so enemies, right? If they all aligned, right, against America, America wouldn't be able to defeat them. We have this, yes, we have this unsurpassed military might. We have nuclear weapons, but nobody's going to get into a nuclear war because the whole world will become extinct. It's not like before, the sort of arms that we had before. The whole world will become extinct, right? So even America, we have to be very cautious with our power and think like Augustus, right? Yes, everybody knows we're powerful. Let's focus. So our leaders have to focus on developing us, right? Developing our civilization, our culture. We need to focus on improving our people. Our status as world power is unrivaled. It's assured. Yes, China is rising. China is an economic power. Um, there are other ways. There's look the consistent thing you learn in history, right? Rome is the only empire that lasted for about 1,000 years, but it even has to go through different iterations, different reincarnations. It moved from the west to the east. It broke up from having one emperor to having four emperors because it was too large, right? So that's where learning different things, right? And that's what Karl Marx calls dialectics, right? The haves and the have-nots are engaged in a constant battle, right? It's called thesis and antithesis, right? Dialectics. Nothing is stagnant. If you're at the top, I remember I had an interview in investment banking, and this was the analysis that the guy interviewing me for investment banking said. It was over 20 years ago. He said he doesn't like to be at the top because if you're at the top, your target. Everyone's taking a shot at you. So you have to keep fending that off. All right. Those are the top. It's good, but it's temporary because everybody wants your position. But if you occupy just an okay position, number three, number two, that's what he actually told me. Right. If you occupy not a position that's up there, but not the number one position, and you're not a target. That number one is an easy target. So we're number one now, right? So we're a target for every power, right? And there's some powers, maybe they don't really need to be number one. Who knows? Or they think, well, America will unravel itself, it'll shoot itself in the foot. Sometimes there's genius in knowing when not to do anything, not to take any action. And that was the brilliance of Augustus, right? The first emperor of Rome. He knew when not to take action, when not to act, right? It's very difficult, especially in a world that's constantly in flux. Geopolitics is constantly in flux. So yeah, I thought I should discuss Napoleon Bonaparte today and what unraveled him. The major powers he defeated included, and then England, which he had not defeated, but he kept trying to invade. They had defeated him at sea in the Battle of Trafalgar and elsewhere under Lord Nelson, Horatio Nelson, and eventually when your enemies all gather against you, no matter your brilliance, no matter how powerful you are, they can bring you down. Something that's consistent in history, I love studying history. Something you learn is every rise has an eventual fall, right? Every empire that has risen, whether it's the Mongolian Chinese empire, China has been there before. It's not the first time that they were at the top. They've been there several times with the Qing dynasty, the Mongolian Empire. This was over 1,000 years ago, right? They've been there before. They invented guns, they invented gunpowder, right? England's been there. England wasn't there for 3 centuries at the top, right? You can say America is a continuation of the English Empire because it was created by Anglo-Saxon men, right? Englishmen. So maybe the War of Independence was really a civil war, right? Even though it was on two different continents. I mean, the Roman Empire, when we talk about the Roman Empire being the longest empire, it didn't remain in Rome, right? They moved from the west to the east because they kept being attacked by the Germanic tribes, right? And the Visigoths, all the Goths, they kept being attacked, right? And so they moved it to the Eastern Empire, right? So we include that as part of the Roman Empire, which fell in about the 15th century. That's in Byzantium when it fell to the Ottoman Empire. Uh, um, so we can say that the American Empire, the American Republic, is sort of a continuation of the British, in a way, because the people who led our governments, who rebelled against the British Crown, were actually Englishmen. George Washington, John Adams, right? Thomas Jefferson. These were Englishmen, right? And initially, they were just fighting for their rights to be represented as Englishmen in Parliament. They didn't get it. Well, they said, well, screw you. They aligned with England's rivals, France. Without the secret financing of the uh, King of France, that's Louis XVI, who got beheaded during the French Revolution, America would not have become a country, would not have been independent, right? Without Napoleon selling Louisiana, the Louisiana purchase which doubled the land mass of America and gave us very rich territories, right, including the Ohio Valley area, gave us very rich territories. We would not have had the might. And of course, our leaders eventually had this notion of the manifest destiny, that it was their destiny to conquer all the lands from the Atlantic, the West Coast, to the Atlantic, the East Coast, to the West Coast, to the Pacific, right? Which our leaders did, unfortunately dispossessing native indigenous people, Americans, and the consequent Trail of Tears and other atrocities against native indigenous people that happened. So again, what Donald Trump has done, everybody thinks people are the easy narrative is to say, well, he did it for to enrich his billionaire friends, right? To enrich his billionaire friends by grabbing Venezuela's oil. Of course, we know Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. And only Venezuela's oil is different from every other nation's oil because it's the only nation that has oil for 1,000 years, right? No other nation has that. That's over 885 years, right? It has that oil. So it's a uh, very strategic resource. So it's China. The objective is to actually checkmate China, America's only rival right now. The objective is to use America's military force. That's something no one can rival us in currently. The lethality of the U.S. military. By the way, I'm a pacifist. I'm not saying I do not support what happened. I'm a pacifist. I'm not into war, violence. I'm a historian, however. I analyze things. These are the benefits of reading history. You're able to understand what's going on, right? You're able to, see beyond the smoke screen and look under the hood, right? And I'm also a lawyer. And by the way, I also was a STEM major. I'm an accountant, so I understand business. Have an MBA, I understand business. And I I can't call myself a mathematician because I don't practice math, but I was a math major, right? 4 courses in calculus at Columbia, right? Statistics in business school, linear algebra, ordinary differential equations, and all the sciences, physics, right? So all of those things, I'm able to analyze and understand, put all of these things together, synthesize, right? And say what's really going on and look under the hood. Um, again, Realpolitik of Otto von Bismarck, the notion is like you got to break a few eggs. That's how an American would put it. You got to break in a few eggs. That's do things that are not pleasant in order to have a result that they think is pleasant. To make an omelet, break a few eggs to make an omelet. That's Realpolitik. Um, Again, empires, we worship and venerate the classics, right? The classics. That's a study of the Latins, of the Romans, right? The Romans did terrible things. We never talk about that. We're always glorifying the Romans. The Romans committed genocide, right? Genocide of the Gauls, the enslaved people. Lots of people in people in the Roman Empire were enslaved. Slavery was not a pretty thing, and that empire lasted for how long? Nobody talks about the torture that these people went through. So, and today, uh, America really, they're trying to, again, the action by Donald Trump on January 3, 2026 was really to checkmate China's incursion into Venezuela and, their access to Venezuelan oil. That's really what it is. Again, I suppose Congress had the power, had the ability to stop Donald Trump. It was obvious what was happening, right? There was an initial failed attempt by a former Green Beret in 2020 under President Trump's first administration, Jordan Goodrow. He said it. He kept saying it. That, hey, that it was the CIA and all the Trump, insiders who urged him on and all that stuff. Instead, the government, yeah, I guess it's a smoke screen. I don't know. They charged him. The FBI charged him. He became a wanted man and everything, right? And then the bombings that went on in 2025, saying they were narco terrorists. We don't know who they were, and they're just bombing people. Those were all violations of international law, without a doubt. I'm going to do a subsequent video, as I said, and discuss the source of law in international law. Again, will Congress greenlight Donald Trump's actions? Well, Congress is dominated by Republicans, right? It's dominated by Republicans. They have the ability to pass an act, a law, to prevent him from, committing our military in Venezuela before it happened. They didn't. They had plenty of time to do it. They did not, right? The signs were there. The red flags, this administration signaled what it was going to do it was just telegraphing what it was going to do way in advance. It was obvious, right? But the Congress did nothing. So now that it's happened, and Congress is dominated by Republicans, they're probably going to rubber stamp his action and indemnify him and, give him the go ahead, right? In any event, I'm going to do subsequent videos My name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents. And today I talked about Napoleon. Anything I think I didn't cover, I might do a subsequent video and touch on that. But I want to keep this, I want to stop this, make sure it doesn't get to 1 hour. I also draw attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the court in Montgomery County, Maryland. Talk about false charges. And, I'm understanding that there are people, there are powers who can pervert our rule of law, right? Rule of law, does it exist? It doesn't exist in Montgomery County, Maryland, right? I was raided in my home. I was swatted by Montgomery County police, rogue agents of the Department of Defense, in order to cover up fraud and obstruct justice, raided me in my home May 16, 2023, without probable cause. I'm a law abiding citizen. I'm a man of unimpeachable integrity, and I pride myself on that. But I was raided, and Montgomery County law enforcement, including a Demarcus Coleman, falsified a police report. Sergeant Charles Drengwitz falsified a police report as well. They used a man called Jide Iwari to impersonate himself as my uncle, a man who has dementia, probably, who's not my uncle, right? These men over 80 in their 70s, they might be dangerous people. And so we've got to be very careful. These people that are very aged, they might feel that, they won't suffer consequences from their desperate and irrational actions, right? So Judge Bonaparte himself, I think he must be a septuagenarian at least. He might be suffering from dementia, but they are reckless and they are dangerous, right? I'm not an ageist, but my rights, my constitutional rights have been violated. I've been dehumanized. I was almost killed. I was assaulted in my home without due process of law. So, right now, the world's clutching its pearls, talking about America violating international law. America violates laws in its own, in its own backyard, in its own, within our country. We don't have rule of law. I never knew this could happen, right? And of course, corporate media is corrupt. They're bought and controlled. They're dishonest, right? No one's carried it in the media. How could 40 cops come with a helicopter, drones, everything, come and raid a man in his own home? I'm not a drug dealer. I'm not a terrorist, right? I was just somebody working in the United States government. I'm not a spy. I'm not a foreign spy. Even if I were, why isn't it in the news? Why isn't it in the news? I was removed, and then they filed false charges against me. They tried to coerce me, right, to lie and coerce me to take a plea bargain, a false plea bargain. And then they filed false charges to try and blackmail me and extort me. This is what they do in third world countries. So it's par for the course what the President of the United States has done, right, in going to um, kidnap a foreign president, right, violate international laws, violate that country's laws there, and on trumped up charges, pretextual, right? Our law enforcement does it in America. There's no rule of law. My rule of law has been violated. My constitutional rights have been violated. It's a perversion of the legal process. It's happening in the state of Maryland with impunity. The media, everybody turns a blind eye, right? I was working in the federal government, the Department of Defense, Department of the Navy. This judge said he wanted me to lose my job, locked me up for 15 months, placed me under house arrest for a year, right? Impoverished me, took away, they wanted to ordered a power of attorney to be able to extort money from my family back in Nigeria. This is a judge, a state attorney. They're doing it in America. They're extorting people like gangsters, and this is racism, right? It wouldn't happen to a white male or white female. It wouldn't happen to them. But I'm still, even though I'm an American citizen, I am viewed as a foreigner that they can extort. In fact, the police officer used epithets, called me an animal. A police officer, Jeffrey Ray, in front of an administrative judge. They didn't say anything. They fabricated things. I have no mental illness, no history of mental illness. I'm always pellucid, They just fabricated things, gaslighting, right? It happens here in America. And so when people are talking about the atrocities against blacks, I understand because I'm experiencing it now. I'm experiencing it now. It happens, right? There's a depraved, morally bankrupt class of people like Judge James Bonifant and the state attorney in Montgomery County, John McCarthy. They're racists. They're members of probably a white supremacist gang that's a threat to the national security of America. Because America, we're a diverse nation. E pluribus unum, we're a diverse nation. And that diversity is our strength. And they're now threatening the security of America, right? These are dinosaurs. They're dinosaurs. They're dangerous for the current security of America. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.